Welcome to Next Steps to Leadership with your host, Dr. Stephen Oliver. In each episode, we invite experts to share their passion and their leadership journey to help you in your next steps. You can find this show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, hrcvision.com. Now here's the host of Next Steps to Leadership, Dr. Stephen Oliver.
Hello and welcome to all. I'm Dr. Stephen Oliver, or Dr. O. Welcome to my podcast, Stepping Up to Leadership, or Taking the Next Steps in Leadership. Really glad to have you in this podcast today. So thank you very much for coming. The goal of our podcast is to help leaders think about taking the next step in their leadership journey. We focus on newer or mid-level leaders and what are some of their next steps as they're going in their journey of leadership. But this podcast is open to all leaders, whether you've been around for a while or you're brand new, or maybe even you're just taking the next step in your own career in your life and leadership. So we're really glad to have you in this, as I just said. I invite executives, senior leaders, consultants, academic professors, all types of folks to give their perspective of their career, their background, and how they succeeded in their leadership career. And they talk just a little bit about some of the successes and the challenges that they have had and give a topic for that next step. So again, welcome. I'm very excited to have my next guest here today in this podcast. This is Dr. Raj Ramachandran. So excited to have you, Dr. Raj. Raj Ramachandran, he's a trusted talent advisor and experienced business leader. He focuses on helping executives and their teams to be courageous and to go forward to navigate in really complex and challenging roles that they face. Dr. Raj has been a senior partner with WittKieffer Leadership Advisory Practice, and he collaborates closely with his colleagues to help those clients to broaden their firm's ability to improve the quality of life through impactful leadership. So very, very interesting. Raj is a 25-year veteran of leadership consulting and dedicated to really enriching the values of the lives of their clients, institutions, and the larger world. So they go more than just helping in their business practices. It's not only their work and the challenges, but in their own lives. And Dr. Raj has advised and coached CEOs, senior leaders, top managers in companies to help them with their operations. He also speaks. He is a speaker, goes to lots of conferences and gives speakers. Dr. Raj has his doctorate of education from the University of Pennsylvania, and it's called the Penn CLO program. CLO stands for Chief Learning Officer. So do I, and that's how we met. And Dr. Raj also has a bachelor's degree in biochemistry from the Ohio State University with a minor in philosophy, and that's really key. So welcome, Dr. Raj. Really great to see you and have you today.
Thank you, Stephen. And again, it's fascinating as you're kind of doing this. I really commend you because I know these are just great venues to learn, to be part of some really great things. So I really am glad you're doing this, and really welcome, and I'm glad to be here.
Well, thank you so much, and so glad to have you. So very quickly, how Dr. Raj and I met. So as I just mentioned, he is a graduate of this Penn CLO program, this doctorate of education. And we were the first inaugural members. We were part of the first class or cohort several years ago. Can't believe it. And this was the whole premise that Dr. Doug Lynch, who was the beginner leader of this program, thought he could take executives and learning leaders in a rapid doctoral program and push us through and teach us how to study, learn, think more academically, and get us to do a doctoral dissertation in a rapid period of time. It was crazy. And so we were all very excited, and nervous, to say the least. And there was you went to the University of Pennsylvania, you studied for a week in class, and then you went home wherever you were, because students were all over the country and now all over the world, and then came back and gave presentations, and it just was an exciting and challenging time. And we met, and I mentioned philosophy because this is one thing I love about Dr. Raj is we would always have these really exciting and theoretical and deep conversations. You don't just get a quick answer from Raj. Well, sometimes you do, but just some really wonderful, um, deep thoughts and deep thinking and great responses. And still to this day, he'll call me or I'll call him and like, hey, what do you think about this? And we go deep. And that's one thing I always admired and really commended you on, Dr. Raj. The second thing is he's a family man. He's got two sons, wife, and connected to his parents, and he'll tell you about that and his heritage. Um, but I remember when your second son was born, and so time has flown.
What's crazy? Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about something where we had we talked about this, and it's wild because when you think about how quickly our families, evolve and grow up. I mean, there was this thing where I think I had it up on I think there's this image, right? So if I share this with you, if I can pull it up. Are you able to? Am I able to? Yeah, there it is. So literally, this is this is where when you were, when you first met me, our second son was just born literally February of 2007, and now obviously this is where they are today, and the young one's getting ready to think about college, and the older one's working. It's just amazing how time flies. So yes, it's been fantastic.
Well, and it's great. And you always send me these pictures via text of your beautiful family and where you're going. And I believe you just went to Japan.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what this is. So this is our Japan trip. Yeah, this is us going to Japan, and yeah, we did that in December. It was fantastic. But
Yeah.
yeah.
It's so great to see your sons as they're young, and then now as maturing, growing up, young men. So that's fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, and you'll hear more about that.
Yeah.
So let's get started on our podcast. And Dr. Raj is going to talk about leadership lenses. So I encourage all of those listening to how this can help you think about these leadership lenses. But Dr. Raj has really we kind of planned out our questions, which is great. And he's really put a great perspective on honoring his past and some of the things of his past that got him to where he is today. So the first thing I just wanted to see, Raj, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do. First and foremost, what do you do, and a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I know you did a great introduction. It can be confusing, like when there's a lot of words and a lot of things in there. But the thing I'd call out, so basically, what I think about me is a leadership advisor. I love leadership. Everything that comes to leadership, that's always been very fascinating to me. But the firm I work with right now, WittKieffer, we're an executive search firm, and we place leaders in, think of big hospital systems, life sciences, or even universities. Right, so we'll do the placements of chancellors and presidents, and the things that you think about. Our firm does that. What I do particularly, though, is the leadership component of that. So imagine after you place a leader, how do you make sure they're successful in role? So there's onboarding, there's coaching, there's development, there's helping their teams be successful. It's all in line in service of you making sure that those organizations and those leaders are successful in role. So that's kind of what I do. As far as how I got into this work, and I'll get into this in terms of background, but I spent probably the first 10 years of my career, when you knew me, I was doing systems consulting work with Accenture and IBM and others, and a lot of technology work, right? As you imagine, these big systems that you put in. And I realized, as much as I love the technology and innovation, it kept coming back to people, Stephen. It kept coming back to like, hey, it's not just tech, it's about the people involved in these things. And that's kind of what led me to Penn CLO, was like, I wanted to understand kind of, why people do what they do and why organizations do what they do. So the program was fantastic, as you said, really deep, and you get kind of accelerated learning in that way. But it got me in this leadership space that I am today in, right? When it comes to the coaching work and the development and the team, work that we do, it came out of the work that we did at Penn CLO. So I'll talk about that, but that's really kind of what led me to, to the work that I do today.
That's fantastic, and the people piece is so important. Just another aside on the Penn CLO program. It's a doctorate of education, and we are studying adult education. Adult education is very different than traditional K through 12, but it's also the business of leadership and the business of education. Companies spend $1.9 billion on training and learning of folks. And so it was a really unique program, focusing on that people, that human side that you just said, but then there's also the business side of learning,
Right.
which is what you did. So just wanted to give that aside.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, sorry. So I guess as you're saying that too, I mean, even kind of connecting it back to background, I think what may be important or relevant to share, Stephen, especially with your audience, is thinking about how do we end up where we are, right? You always think about these journeys that we're on. And I'll give you a little color. I was actually born in Petersburg, Virginia, and I lived in like places like Albertville, Alabama, and Colonial Heights, Virginia, which I know you're familiar with. In these small towns to immigrant parents. My parents came here in the 60s and 70s from India. And we grew up in the South because my father was a textile engineer, right? So I definitely had my fair share of challenges, especially with my unique last name, right? In terms of being able to navigate in those kind of spaces. But it generally made me want to know why people do what they do. Like I got really curious about why are people this way? And even as a young child, I kept thinking about that. Right, that was really important to me. So that was kind of, that kind of informed, part of who I am. But the other is, I was born with congenital cataracts, so I was born legally blind, and I was, I had 10 operations on my eyes before I was 10 years old. So I couldn't play sports. I wasn't coordinated enough to throw a football or hit a baseball, whatever. So I fell in love with books. Right. And I became like this avid reader, very much an introvert. And it's kind of where, like you and I would talked about this in terms of getting deep, but it's because of that introversion that I would find myself reading a lot. But guess what? I thought I wanted to go to med school, right? I thought I wanted to be an ophthalmologist and kind of save people's eyes, if you will. It's kind of why my passion for healthcare and science became such a thing. But I'll tell you, there was this quote, I forget when, it was probably somewhere in middle school. And it was this Helen Keller quote that struck me, Stephen. It was basically, the quote said, the only thing worse than being blind is having sight and no vision. And that just like hit me, right? It was like, whoa, it wasn't just, not having great eyesight, but what does it mean to have perspective and vision? And that's kind of what got my attention, kind of became this red thread, as I was growing up and going through college and the work that I did. And it made me kind of realize that, this idea of having purpose and helping others find perspective, that's what I love doing, right? And that's where these lenses of leadership kind of came out of without me realizing it. Kind of came from this idea of perspective, lenses, seeing, you can kind of see all that kind of coming together.
So that's such a great connection, the lenses of leadership connected to your childhood experience. I really appreciate you sharing that. Ironically, I grew up not too far up the road from where you were in Northern Virginia, Vienna, Virginia.
Wow.
So not that far from you.
Yeah.
So was there some type of a formative experience in your childhood other than this, your blindness that impacted you, or was this the experience that impacted you?
Yeah, I mean, that one definitely, it was a formative experience. I mean, I think about those perspectives that I got from, from navigating through those challenges of dealing with eyesight and whatnot. So I say that really did help, inform me. But I'd also say like, my parents, as I'm sure, everyone says, your parents or relatives have an influence on you. And for me, it was my father, because he when he immigrated, he had challenges with language, right? English was not his mother tongue, so he was challenged with that. So he picked up, he started going to Toastmasters, and I don't know if you're familiar or if your audience is familiar, but it's basically a place for practicing public speaking, right? It's an organization that does public speaking. And he thought it was really important that that skill be learned. So in middle school, he actually made me, do my first Toastmaster speech. And I was petrified, right? You're in front of a audience of strangers and you're like, and I go, what do I talk about? And he goes, well, you just came back from India. Talk about your experience going to India. And I gave this, this speech, and I mumbled and stumbled as we do when you're doing this at the beginning, but the audience was really engaged, and they were, they were adults, but they were curious about how I described things, and it just made me realize I love the energy in the room and creating what I call light bulb moments, right? That's why I think the teaching and the sharing was so really helped me profoundly realize that I could, with practice, get better at that. Right. So I started seeing those red threads show up. So that was an important kind of, I think, experience in terms of doing something like that.
That's fantastic. That immigrant experience, and then what your father went through, and then what he instilled in you to be a better person. That's a really great sense of leadership that your father gave to you.
Yeah.
Now, you said you love to read. Did you enjoy school?
Yeah, that's a good question. I laugh. I laugh because I was a product of a public school, education system, right, in small town Ohio, and I made average grades, and it was nothing out of the ordinary. I mean, it was good. I didn't want to, short shift that. It was good, but because of that, I decided to stay at home. That's why I went to Ohio State, because I thought I wanted to study science, as I said, wanted to be a doctor. But here's the thing that really struck me. It was this organic chemistry professor. So I decided to take summer school, in order to try to get ahead and do some, like wanted that organic chemistry is the weed out course, for those that are in this path. And I went to this community college in Dayton, and it was really what taught me was the difference between good teaching. Like, what does a good teacher do? And this particular professor, Stephen, he was experienced in the workplace. He came from industry. And he made the class so much more interesting and interactive because he could bring in that experience into the room, right? So I thought that was so cool, where you didn't just have this theoretical, person that was doing a bunch of research. They actually could apply the things they learned in business, in the real world, and bring it into the classroom. And I thought that was such a cool thing. And obviously that inspired me to say, hey, maybe there's a connection that you can do something beyond pure, lecture and theory, and pulling that together. So that was really a nugget that helped, where having, a professor like that was helpful. There's always, one teacher that does that for you, hopefully, in life.
And such a great connection to the your doctoral program, and some of the professors we had that did some of the same things.
Exactly.
Just real quickly, Dr. Raj, how does reflecting upon your past, your childhood, your parents, how does that help some of our audience who are looking at that next step in leadership? How can reflecting and going back help us in doing that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the notion is, it's kind of like this thread that I pulled in, where I called it, honoring the past and being kind of honest about the present and hopeful about the future. And I use that in lots of things, but honoring the past and who you are, and kind of figuring out, and I'll talk about this later with the lenses, but it helps you kind of understand, hey, you're doing things, whether you realize it or not, based on the elements of what brought you here, right? And that's a combination of your experiences, it's a combination of your genetics, it's a combination of, how you were raised. All these things kind of inform you. So I think paying attention to those and understanding how to leverage that is really a lot of what I end up doing, even in my coaching, where it's like bringing some of that in and saying, hey, this is kind of why maybe you are the way you are. And I think that's helped me kind of understand, how I lead and where those challenges are, those blind spots. So I think it's really important to understand that, but not ruminate on it, right? Sometimes we can get caught up on it and get stuck in the past. It doesn't, those things don't matter anymore, right? They're in the past. But how can you learn from that and help you, do better today?
That's fantastic. It really, I believe, just like you're saying, it's so important to think about the past and what are those stepping stones as we move forward. Now, you've done a lot of work, some process work, technology, leadership consulting, as we've said, and the industries are high tech, energy sectors, and across America, Europe, and even Asia. And then, from what I understand is you have another family influence from your grandfather in South India. Tell us just a little bit about some of that experience from him and what he gave you.
Well, and again, I like where you're going with this, because here's the thing. What I realized is, yes, I have done, like in my consulting experience, and, being in Asia and Europe and in the US, and then all these industries, and I kind of, going back to thinking about your past and what that does to inform you. I my mother was big on spending time with my grandparents when I was growing up. So I'd go visit them in India. And I remember this is one of my summers where I went to see my grandfather. And it was a summer vacation between college and my first job, right? So this is like after college, Ohio State. I had my first job, and I said I was going to spend time in India. And I remember this because I was on a morning walk with my grandfather, and he kind of shared a bit about his philosophy, right? He's very fast paced. What I can share with you is that he actually started off as a chemist himself, and he
Oh,
built
wow.
textile stores in South
Mhm.
India. Because in India, that whole idea of cotton, and that was where it was big with Gandhi. It was like this notion of like building, using your hands and building clothing or making clothes was really a big part of India back then. And he eventually ended up building a college. And this is my grandfather, and a temple. And what I noticed is he did his temple work in the morning. He would do his college administration work in the afternoon, and then he ran the textile stores in the evenings. And you probably know, some football practices are sometimes called two-a-days, where they practice, twice in order to get ready, AM, PM. My grandfather called it three-a-days. He had a morning, afternoon, and an evening. He had three kind of distinct things that he did. So obviously he had an incredible work ethic. But what I truly admired about him, Stephen, was that he loved what he did, right? He didn't see it as punching a clock. He felt that doing what you love matters, and making sure that it provided a positive impact on people in society. So that definitely stuck with me. Like when you make job choices, it's not just to put food on the table or to like pay the bills. Or I know a lot of us have, we come from different circumstances where we have to make ends meet. I get that. And again, we didn't grow up in a lot either. But I think what I took away was we spent so much time working, right? So trying to figure out that doing something that you really enjoy or find passion in it is really important. I learned that from my grandfather as I navigated my own career.
That's fantastic. A great story. Grandparents are so impactful. I was lucky. We lived across the street from one set of grandparents, and they were so influential.
Wow.
Um, and so if people can connect with their relatives or older folks, I think that's great. Great story. And it sounds like he was a busy man.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
And
we,
he lived until his he lived in early 90s. I mean, he
wow.
felt that working, and that's what gave him the purpose, was doing what he did, right?
Yeah.
So, and he could keep working to that age, which is pretty amazing. Like not all of it, but he could do a lot of it.
Yeah. So shifting gears to now,
Yeah.
you have some leadership lenses that you use in your practice, and I want to know if you could tell us a little bit about these three lenses, and
Yeah.
then how do you connect them to your practice?
Yeah, so I'll give you one more quick nugget, and then I'll kind of go into how the lenses came to be. So like back in 2010, when we were in the Penn CLEP program, I was also part of Accenture, had this leadership development program for like, I guess, it's almost like partner prep school, if you will, right? One of our assignments was to kind of figure out a professional journey line, which is kind of essentially, how are you doing on certain projects, and what does that look like? And I noticed this pattern where in certain projects, I was happier and more productive versus others. And I was trying to figure
Mhm.
out why. And I noticed it was about my energy levels. And it made me,
Mhm.
made me kind of curious about the leaders I worked with, right? So that's just kind of where it started,
Mhm.
if you will, in terms of these lenses. I noticed where certain kinds of leaders I gravitated to more, and others I did not. And I was trying to figure out what that was all about. So that's kind of where it started,
Mhm.
without me realizing it. When I was in the program, I was noodling on lots of things, as you know, and ask a lot of questions, and it was
Mhm.
very engaging. But that's kind of where it initially started. And then I would say, fast forward to COVID, we were all, in this crazy lockdown, right, that we're
Yes,
all in.
definitely.
And I was starting to think about this more in terms of like, what are those characteristics that made the best leaders, who they are? Like
Mhm.
what made them so good? And I started doing research on this topic, and I'll share something with you too. Actually, can I pull up a slide, because that may be helpful. And let's see if I can do this. Yeah, there it is. The next slide. Um, Sorry, I can advance this. Great. Okay, no, I got it. Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
So here's the thing, Stephen. I started noticing this pattern, right, where in the '90s I kept thinking, what made for the best leaders. And as you probably remember, Daniel Goleman was like a big, I think his book came out in '95, but it was almost like this whole thing around like, the importance of social awareness and empathy, and reading the social currents, understanding communication skills. That was like the big thing. It felt like that was still that was still there as the thing, right? And then like I think it kind of shifted where it moved from those social skills, to like in the 2000s, it was all about execution and like driving results. I feel there's a lot around, how do you think about results and outcomes? And there's this book called, Execution by Ramachandran and Larry Bossidy that kind of hit the stage and was really big, right? And the tens, I could argue, a lot of Elon Musk and Bezos and, this idea of innovation and it being about creating a simple and compelling vision, right? That's all what it was all about, right? Kind of putting all that together. That was kind of how it played, right? So I kept wondering, like, what was the 2020s going to be about? And I'm curious, as you kind of see this, you may think that, what it is all about is really it could be cyclical. It could be the next thing is, hey, maybe we're going back and we need to be more about emotions. And, you think about the current environment that we need to be all about kind of empathy and self-awareness, these kind of things. And I wondered that, right? Is that the era that we're in? Is it back to coming to that? But what I realized is it's not any one thing, right? I think the best leaders are some combination of the three. And that's how we came up with the model, the framework, right? And we call it the leadership, leadership impact, fueling transformation or lift. But think of it as like, there's the visionary leaders, the big picture type vision leaders. There are the execution leaders, the ones that are really good for getting things done. And then there are the relationship leaders, the ones that are really good about connecting and building those relationships, right? So we keep seeing these patterns, but that's what we notice is that it's kind of, these three types are emerging in terms of the kinds of leaders that seem to be successful today.
And so just real quickly before I ask you about these three, I think you are really on the right track that we're kind of cycling back. I am blessed. I teach a emotional intelligence course for undergraduates, and I use Dr. Goleman a lot, Daniel Goleman, in my teaching, and get them to read books. And he has a brand new book out called Optimization. How to optimize your emotions. What are things you can do? And I think more and more companies, not only given the current climate, there's a lot more emotions out there, but how can leaders optimize their emotions as they lead people? And that can be something to really help our listeners of the podcast. So you're headed in the right direction.
Thank you. No, and I think you're right, especially in this advent of artificial intelligence and where technology is going. I think those relationship skills are going to be even more important, right? Optimizing emotions, that's going to be even more, I think more critical. I agree with that.
Well, I see another podcast with you on AI because that's huge.
That's crazy. Yeah, crazy.
Would you mind just a little bit to tell us about these, a little more in depth on these leadership lenses? Visionary leadership, operational leadership, relational leadership. Tell us a little bit more about them.
Yeah, look, there's, obviously we could do a whole session on this and we're gonna spare that for our listeners. But what I can tell you is, when we kind of came to be on this or put this together, here's what we noticed, which I think is fascinating because these lenses are, like the visionary leaders, and again, I'm using a healthcare lens because a lot of the work that I do right now is in healthcare, but you could, I think, apply this in any industry. They're the ones that kind of create that strategy and that vision and where are we headed, right? They're the ones that are kind of helping us think about the future and what do we need to do to kind of get there from setting up those pieces. And then the operational ones are the ones that are, like I said, they're the ones that are trying to get things done and really kind of drive for results. How do we think about executing and making sure that we're harnessing the power of the organization to get those things done? But it takes that relationship, it takes that connectivity, the ability to kind of really engage. That's really key to this. And I think if you look at it, those three lenses, think about it as like, I call it the telescope, the zooming out, the microscope, the zooming in, and then the stethoscope, right? The ability to connect, right? So it's like, that's a quick way to kind of think of those three. But here's the thing that's fascinating, Stephen. We did all this research and what we found out was there's actually a missing lens, the fourth lens. And that is actually what we call the inner scope. It's about self-management, really understanding self-awareness. And what you said earlier was really key because what the Daniel Goleman research and where it's all headed, that optimization of that emotional intelligence is what we believe is in that self-management, self-awareness scope, right? Because it is really understanding who you are and knowing how to engage and connect to these other lenses, right? Because you have to know when to be visionary, when to be operational, when to be relational. That's what makes it so difficult. And understanding yourself is what's going to allow you to be better at doing that in the audiences that you work with.
So, if you could say a little bit more about this self awareness, I had the honor of having another guest, Dr. Patricia Sullivan, who did her doctoral dissertation on self awareness, and she gave a
Yeah.
great podcast. But just a little more, I'd like to hear
Yeah.
your vision on that, and also how do you pivot between these different lenses? Because that's another tough skill is to pivot and be situational.
It is. So I think, again, putting definitions on this may be helpful. Like this, and this came from, I think, Tasha Eurich. I think she's an organizational
Mhm.
psychologist and researcher, and she authored a book called Insight. And I think she gave an interesting definition. Having self-awareness is your ability to perceive and understand the things that make you who you are as an individual, including your personality, your actions, your values, your beliefs, and thoughts. Right. So remember we started this whole thing with around understanding your past, right? So like
Mhm.
that is part of your self-awareness. It defines who you are. And then with that greater self-awareness, I think you're able to then learn how to make these pivots. And I think the ones and here's the irony, the ones that actually say they're really self-aware may not be the most self-aware, right? Because
Right.
it takes this notion of you have to keep working on this thing, right? It's not a one and done kind of check the box, I'm self-aware, and you move on. You have to keep working on it. And I'll share some tips a little later on what you can do with that to build more
Mhm.
self-awareness. But it takes really, the ability to kind of learn how to pivot across these lenses is creating more self-awareness and knowing, hey, this is a trigger point for me. I know hey, getting into doing visionary work may not be where I'm strong, right?
Mhm.
So I may have to go back to understanding, executing, and delivering. That's where I start.
Mhm.
But I'm working on becoming more strategic, right? How do I do that? That takes a whole bunch of self-awareness.
Yes. And how about these are three great lenses: visionary, operational, relational.
Mhm.
But I believe relational is so key. What advice can you give to our leaders who are trying to think about stepping up as far as developing their relational lens?
Oh, wow. Well, look, I mean, all
Mhm.
these take a lot of effort, but that one in particular, I think maybe it sounds obvious, but I think it starts with listening, actively listening,
Mhm.
paying attention, being in the moment, like this idea of being 100% present when you're having conversations. We tend to, want to go right into the next
Mhm.
thought, but being in the moment means that you're actively listening. And then asking those open-ended questions, right? So kind of reserving judgment and being open in the moment to asking those kind of questions that
Mhm.
open the aperture. That I think helps you relate and connect. And then just realizing that it takes work. It takes a lot of
Mhm.
effort. There's actually a book that I've been reading. I don't know if you're familiar with Charles Duhigg. He wrote this book
Mhm.
called The Power of Habits. He has a new one
Yes.
called Super
Mhm.
Communicators, which is fascinating, right? Because he talks about this whole thing about what do the super communicators do differently? And they're doing a lot of these. They're actively engaged. They're asking open-ended questions. They're really connecting with their audience as opposed to making it about themselves, right? And that does take a huge amount of self-awareness.
And there's another emotional intelligence leader, Travis Bradberry. He just came out with a book, Emotional Intelligence Habits, and he's got about
Mm.
20 or so habits to use. So that's great about habits. And I so agree with you in respect to building relationships takes time. I'm a
Yes.
big networker and I'm having lunch and coffee. And some people say, is that all you do is have lunch and coffee? But it's like, it takes time and it's over years and years and it
Yes.
must be honest and genuine. So
It does.
um, I appreciate that. I wanted to know if we could go a little forward to some of those tips
Yeah.
for these lenses and what can
Yeah.
our audience who are trying to step up, what are some tips they can do to utilize these
Yeah.
lenses?
Well, and I'm sure you've done so many of these. So as I share these, I'm curious to get your reaction to it, and maybe you can build on it, with me. But what I've noticed, again, remember it's a journey, and I can share there's this notion of, I this is I think this is from an HBR article at some point, but I've been seeing this kind of show up more as I have my coaching conversations with people, and even doing the development work that I do. One thing is just to kind of write down, like, what are your priorities? I mean, the notion of just literally saying, here's what I'm going to accomplish today, or what I'm hoping to accomplish today, or this week, or this month. Taking that moment to write down, what your plans and priorities are, I think is really key. The other is just these psychometric tests. I'm sure you're familiar with, like you've taken, even in the Penn program, we took a number of these things, but Hogan assessment's really good because it talks about kind of, on a good day, how do you show up? When you're stressed, how do you show up? A bit about your values. I think just getting those kind of psychometric tests are good. Asking trusted friends, like when you're having your coffee or your lunches, asking your friends about, how you show up, I think helps you. And getting feedback, like doing kind of performance reviews, or, I think performance reviews on an annual basis is too long. I think you can do them a little better. And then reflecting, like, really journaling, writing things down again. People are now, meditation is a good form of kind of driving some self-awareness, getting some silence time or nature. I think there's lots of things you can do. I'll tell you the one that I think is interesting. This idea of like asking trusted friends. I think it's fascinating, right? Because I did this thing where, because psychometrics can take a lot of time, and, feedback takes prior to, but like if I just did this via text, I'd be like, hey, how do I show up to you, right? After that conversation, how did I show up? And I kept noticing these patterns. And something that struck me, what I kept hearing was three things for me. I'm just giving my personal, what people shared with me over time. They said my ability to ask good questions, and you would say this. That's something that differentiated me, right? Actively listening was another one. And then the energy that I provide, right? The energy that I bring into a room, or, that was kind of the differentiations for me. And I've been using that a lot. I mean, it's kind of what you can see around me, or how I show up, and, that energy part is really key. But I didn't know that until I really just started asking people, hey, how do I show up, and what can I build on?
I think every one of these are important. And ironically, I do a lot of leadership development training to leaders in this population, newer leaders and mid-level, and all of these are great. I agree with you, Dr. Raj, about the asking a trusted friend and getting feedback. But the thing is I believe you have to be open to that feedback, because a lot of people are not open, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I'll get your feedback," but then the minute they hear it, then they get defensive. So you've got to be open. And the other thing about the test is answer those tests honestly, and then if you don't score really well, um, I give emotional intelligence tests at the beginning of my course, and so many students are really frustrated, and I say, don't be frustrated. You didn't score poorly. These are all opportunities for you to learn and work on. But you got to be open for this feedback. Self-reflection is not easy.
No, it's not. But it's interesting, even the word choice, right? So like the word feedback. So I noticed this. Asking the word, hey, can I get your feedback, immediately does a power differential. I want your feedback because I'm here, and you are God. Tell me what I need to know, right? That causes the defensiveness. So what I've learned to do, and I, even from a coaching perspective, I say, ask for advice. Can I ask for your advice? Right? So using the language, can I get your advice, Stephen, on, hey, what do you think I did well in that?
Yes.
Okay, that word language, just that changing of that one word
Yes.
makes it so much more like I'm more receptive, because now I feel like we're on even footing, as opposed to, hey, you know so much better than me, and I need to, okay, and then I get all defensive, as opposed to, hey, I'd love to get your advice, your perspective. Can I get your perspective on this? Right?
Yes.
It's amazing how just that language shift allows you to kind of be able to take it in better.
Very powerful. So the time has flown, and I have just a couple more quick questions for you. Like I said, we could do like 2 or 3 more podcasts now. Real quickly, what's next for you and your practice, and using the leadership lenses in your space, or with your clients, who you're working with?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're still at the very beginning of this journey, and we're using this framework with our clients. We do it, even with our assessments, when I actually have a call later today with a client where we're helping them develop their next generation of leaders, and we're using these lenses in a way of helping them develop. So we've got kind of questions built into each one of those lenses, and how you can improve upon it. So think of it as a kind of, here you are today, like, and here's where you want to go. Like you said at the beginning of your class, you do that emotional, assessment. And then you can kind of say, how do you build on that? So we've incorporated it into even how we think about our assessing for selection, for development, creating programs around it. So let's just say your organization that you're really good at execution, but you're maybe not as strong on the relationship and the visionary lenses. There's content and there's modules and there's development that you can do around that to strengthen that as an organization, as a team, or as an individual. So there's a lot that's kind of coming out of this, which is amazing to see how it's getting used and leveraged. But the beauty of this stuff is it's a collective, right? So it's not just me, it's a team, and it's how we work with our clients. But I'm super excited by, where I think it's headed and why this is such an important discussion to have.
And to me, that goes back to that first bullet point on write down your plans and priorities. It's like you're giving them a strategy or an action plan of what they can do with these lenses and where they can go. Fantastic. So final question, any final recommendations for our audience, our newer and our mid-level, or anyone, what they can do to utilize these lenses, or where they can go for some models, research?
So a couple of things I could share. One is obviously our website, WittKieffer.com. We're kind of putting out stuff on this, out there more in terms of just the research that we're seeing and the implications. I'm actually doing a webinar, a classroom session at a conference in 2 weeks, talking about these lenses with a group of physicians. So like it's definitely, a thing to consider. But like, I post a lot on LinkedIn, so obviously checking out that kind of stuff. But honestly, I think it's that self-awareness piece where realizing that, spending time to think about those things, asking a colleague, a trusted friend, saying, hey, I'm working on this. I think there's lots of things in the space around developing greater self-awareness is where I would go. And I would really check out this Super Communicator book. I think it's fascinating, right? The research that Charles Duhigg has done. He's very good at narration. Really good at just kind of how do you create more environments to help in this. I think I would check that out as well.
Well, that's fantastic. So, well, Dr. Raj, I just cannot thank you enough for your time, your insight, your information, your family story, your background. I think that's really important, and just your emphasis on leadership lenses, visionary, operational, relational, and just being truly self-aware. So thank you so much for coming. And there's going to be some more podcasts, I see.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate you spending the time with me, and hopefully this was informative for the audience.
Incredible. So thank you everyone for joining Next Steps to Leadership. I'm again Dr. Stephen Oliver, Dr. O. My consultancy is HRC Vision, Leadership, Learning, and HR Consulting. And if you need any assistance, if I can assist you or Dr. Raj can assist you, please contact us. And we thank you for your time and coming to our podcast. Be well, everyone.
You've been tuning into Next Steps to Leadership with your host, Dr. Stephen Oliver. You can find this show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, hrcvision.com. Thank you for your positive feedback, comments, questions, and for sharing the show with others.